We're going to be in Joshua chapter 6. Joshua chapter 6. One of the more well-known instances of the Old Testament. In fact, as far as the invasion of Canaan is concerned, it may be the most well-known. A lot of folks are familiar with what happened at Jericho, but not familiar with what happened at Ai, which we'll talk about next week. And then there are more skirmishes and more battles that are recorded that very few people are familiar with. But this is the big one. This is the first battle after they've crossed the Jordan River. They've been camped within sight of the city. The people of Jericho are walled up inside their city and are afraid of Israel. They've heard about Israel's reputation. They know what they did to the kings on the other side of the Jordan. So this is the footprint. This is where Israel is going to make their start of taking over the land that God had promised to them all the way back to Abraham. But first they have to take Jericho. So we're going to read all of chapter 6 and then go back and make a few points about the reading. Now the gates of Jericho were securely barred because of the Israelites. No one went out and no one came in. What do we call that? Locked down. They were under siege. They were under siege. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men. March around the city once with all the armed men, and do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets on ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times, with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have the whole army give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse, and the army will go up, everyone straight in." So Joshua son of Nun called the priests and said to them, "Take up the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and have 7 priests carry trumpets in front of it." And he ordered the army, "Advance, march around the city, with an armed guard going ahead of the ark of the Lord." When Joshua had spoken to the people, the 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets before the Lord went forward, blowing their trumpets. The ark of the Lord's covenant followed them. The armed guard marched ahead of the priests and blew the trumpets, and the rear guard followed the ark. All this time the trumpets were sounding. But Joshua had commanded the army, "Do not give a war cry, do not raise your voices, do not say a word until the day I tell you to shout. Then shout." So he had the ark of the Lord carried around the city, circling it once. Then the army returned to the camp and spent the night there. Joshua got up early the next morning, and the priests took up the ark of the Lord. The 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets went forward, marching before the ark of the Lord and blowing the trumpets. The armed men went ahead of them and in the rear guard following the ark of the Lord, while the trumpets kept sounding. So on the 2nd day, they marched around the city once and returned to the camp. They did this for 6 days. On the 7th day, they got up at daybreak, marched around the city 7 times in the same manner, except that on that day they circled the city 7 times. The 7th time around, when the priest sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the army, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. And the city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall be spared, because she hid the spies we sent. But keep away from the devoted things, so that you will not bring about your own destruction by taking any of them. Otherwise, you will make the camp of Israel liable to destruction and bring trouble on it. All the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord and must go into his treasury." When the trumpet sounded, the army shouted, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave a loud shout, the wall collapsed. So everyone charged straight in. They took the city. They devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. Joshua said to the 2 men who had spied out the land, "Go into the prostitute's house and bring her out and all who belong to her, in accordance with your oath to her." So the young men who had done the spying went in and brought out Rahab, her father and her mother, her brothers and her sisters, and all who belonged to her. They brought out her entire family and put them in a place outside the camp of Israel. Then they burned the whole city and everything in it. But they put the silver and gold and articles of bronze and iron into the treasury of the Lord's house. But Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her, because she hid the men Joshua had sent as spies to Jericho. And she lives among the Israelites to this day. What does that tell you about when this was written? She lives among the Israelites to this day. At that time Joshua pronounced this solemn oath: Cursed before the Lord is the one who undertakes to rebuild this city of Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn son he will lay its foundations. At the cost of his youngest he will set up its gates. So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame spread throughout the land. All right? There's several things that I find interesting, and you might mention some other things as we go along. But Jericho is it holds two records. It's probably the oldest continually inhabited place on the planet. It goes back like 8,000 years BC, right? So in my calculations, the world was created somewhere around 6,000 BC. So it was there before God created the world. But about 8,000 BC is the guess on it. And it's probably, at least among the very few lowest cities, it's in a rift valley, and it's 670 feet below sea level. So it's a very, very low city and a very, very old city. It has had so many different city structures built inside of it in that time frame that it's a little hard for archaeologists to go in and say, this is the little piece that was being inhabited when the Israelites showed up. There are different parts of the wall. There are different areas of excavation where different people lived at different times. And so what happens is that one archaeologist will come in and say, well, look, I found Jericho, and it's definitely destroyed like the Israelite, or like God said the Israelites destroyed it. And then the next one will come in, Kathleen Kenyon in particular in the 1970s, 60s and 70s, who said, no, it was destroyed 1,500 years before Israel ever got here, so the story can't be true. So they find different parts of it and then try to prove their point depending on that particular part of the inhabitation that's been there for all those different years. They have found, at least in part of the area, walls that are collapsed and a very deep layer of burning. So that could very well be the area in question. It's not a huge place. When you think about how large the entire area is, what the wall might have surrounded, or how far they had to walk, that was a question I thought about. When you get up and they say, okay, we're going to march around Jericho, how long does that take? The best guess that I came up with was that it was somewhere around 7 football fields stuck together, somewhere between 7 and 10 acres. Okay? So it's not huge. You could walk around it fairly easily in a short amount of time. One of the commentators said the problem he sees is that where they were camped was close enough to Jericho that by the time the lead guard got around the city and was headed back, they might actually have to go to the side to let the rear guard come in. So it wasn't a very big place, and it was a very big army. Probably enlarged the original circumference perimeter a little bit to allow for being outside the range of short-range weapons. If we're this far outside the city, they can't throw rocks at us or shoot arrows at us or throw spears or whatever. So you've got a little bit extra room around the outside where they're walking. But 1 lap per day for the first 6 days, and you have a very specific lineup of how they're supposed to go around the city. First of all, you've got a group of fighting men, the advanced guard. If they run into anybody trying to fight back, then this advanced guard, resistance would be a good word. If they run into any resistance, the advanced guard was to take care of that. They were followed by priests who had ram's horns. Their job was just to keep blowing on the horn to remind, I guess, the folks inside Jericho that They were out there and they weren't going anywhere. Then came the Ark of the Covenant. Right? So they've got two groups in front of the Ark and then a rear guard of fighting men behind the Ark. So if anybody tries to come in from behind, you've got a rear guard. The Ark is kind of in the center of the formation, and it's a very long parade of folks that's going around the outer perimeter of the city of Jericho. And again, one lap per day for the first 6 days with the trumpets sounding the whole time. Yes, sir.
Can you imagine, though, how many men in Israel had?
Mm-hmm.
That's more people than what Shamrock, William, and Wellington's got put together.
That's right. Absolutely. I don't think we get an actual census of the armed men here, but there were lots and lots of them. It was a very large army. There were lots more people on the outside of Jericho than there were on the inside.
Yeah.
And they were more, probably better armed. I'm not really sure. They had gained a lot of armaments as they beat people in the desert, right? When they first fought the Amorites would have had a lot of armaments, and they could have created some more along the way. But they're fairly well armed, and they're huge. They're just tons and tons of them.
Just imagine how big their camp was.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why we begin chapter 6 with Jericho was shut up because of the Israel. They're terrified. There's nothing they can do about what's about to happen to them. And Israel is getting ready to come in on them.
There would be more people there. I doubt it for 6,000 people in William, Shamrock, and Wellington.
Maybe not. Maybe not. I won't even throw a guess out on how many they had. At one time, the guess was that in the desert, we had something like 1.6 million people. Yeah. So if you take, say, a third of that, then you've got around 500,000 guys that are of serviceable age. So
Federal was 4,000 men alone.
yeah, so it's a bunch of folks, absolutely.